Hello and welcome back to the Sleepy Darwin. Whether you're here to drift peacefully towards sleep, to unwind after wrestling with the day's complexities, or simply to let your mind wander through the deepest questions of existence, you've found exactly the right place. Tonight, we're embarking on a gentle journey into one of the most profound mysteries humanity has ever contemplated. Could we someday upload a human brain without losing the person inside? This is a story that begins in the firing of neurons and winds through questions that have puzzled philosophers for centuries. We'll explore what makes you uniquely you, whether consciousness could survive a journey from flesh to silicon, and what it might mean to live forever in digital form. Before we begin our quiet descent into these beautiful mysteries, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy these thoughtful explorations, a like and subscribe would mean the world to me and to the neurons currently creating your thoughts right now. And I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you settling in from a bustling city or finding peace in a quiet countryside night? Now, I do hope this isn't so fascinating that it keeps you wide awake contemplating the nature of your own consciousness. But if it does, at least you'll drift off pondering some of the most beautiful questions about what it means to be human. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let's explore together whether the essence of who you are could ever be captured in code. There's something wonderfully fitting about exploring questions of identity in the quiet hours, isn't there? When the world has settled into its evening rhythm and we find ourselves alone with our thoughts, drifting somewhere between wakefulness and dreams. It's in these liminal moments that the biggest questions feel most approachable, most intimate. So let me ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whether you're nestled under blankets in Berlin, watching the city lights twinkle outside your window in Bangkok, or perhaps it's still afternoon where you are, and you're stealing a moment of contemplation with a cup of tea. Let me ask you this. Are you the same person you were yesterday? It seems like such a simple question, doesn't it? Almost absurdly so. Of course you're the same person. You have the same memories, the same name, the same relationships, the same thoughts flowing through the same mind. You woke up this morning and knew, without question, that you were you. But here's where things get beautifully complicated, in the way that only the deepest questions can. Because there's an ancient puzzle that philosophers have been pondering for over 2,000 years, and it goes something like this. Imagine, if you will, the ship of Theseus. Picture it in your mind, a magnificent vessel from ancient Greece, its wooden hull cutting through azure Mediterranean waters, its sails billowing with the same winds that carried Odysseus home. This ship, legend tells us, was preserved by the grateful Athenians as a monument to their heroes' adventures. But here's the thing about wooden ships. Especially ones that sail through salt spray and Mediterranean storms, they need constant maintenance. A plank here begins to rot from the sea's relentless kiss. A beam there splits under the strain of too many voyages. So the caretakers, dutiful and reverent, replace each damaged piece with new wood, identical in every way they can manage. First, it's just a single plank. The ship is still clearly the ship of Theseus, after all. It's just one small piece of wood, among hundreds. Then another plank, then a beam, then a section of the mast. Years pass, maybe decades, and the careful maintenance continues. Piece by piece, plank by plank, the ship is renewed. Until one day, someone asks the question that changes everything. If every single piece of the original ship has been replaced, is it still the ship of Theseus? It's the kind of question that makes you pause mid-step, isn't it? The kind that feels like it should have an obvious answer, until you really start thinking about it. Because logically, rationally, how can something be the same thing if literally none of its original parts remain, and yet, it's been the same ship all along, hasn't it? No one ever declared it a different ship. It never stopped being the ship of Theseus, not for a single day. But wait, the puzzle gets even more deliciously complex. What if someone had been secretly collecting all those discarded pieces? What if they carefully restored each rotting plank, each split beam, and then reassembled them into a ship? Now you have two ships, one made entirely of new wood that everyone agrees is the ship of Theseus, and one made entirely of the original wood from the ship of Theseus. Which one is real? Now, I know what you might be thinking. This is all very philosophical, you might say. But what does an ancient Greek ship have to do with uploading consciousness? And you'd be right to wonder. But here's the beautiful, slightly unsettling truth. You, right there, listening to these words, are the ship of Theseus. Your body, this miraculous vessel that carries your consciousness through the world, is rebuilding itself constantly, perpetually, without you even noticing. Right now, as you listen to these words, millions of your cells are quietly dying while millions more are being born. It's happening in your liver, your skin, your blood, even in parts of your brain. You are, quite literally, in a constant state of becoming. Think about your skin for a moment. Touch your arm. Feel that familiar surface that you've known your entire life. That skin, every single cell of it has been completely replaced in the last month. The skin you're touching now didn't exist when you woke up 30 days ago. Your liver, that tireless factory working away in your abdomen, completely renews itself every 150 to 500 days. The red blood cells flowing through your veins right now, carrying oxygen to every corner of your being, will all be gone and replaced within 4 months. Even your skeleton, seemingly so permanent and solid, is constantly breaking itself down and building itself back up. The bones supporting you right now will be entirely new bones within a decade. You are not built on the same foundation you were built on 10 years ago. You are not even made of the same materials. There's something almost magical about this, isn't there? The idea that you can remain so fundamentally, recognizably you while your entire physical being is renewed again and again, like a river that stays the same river even though the water is always flowing, always changing. But here's where the Theseus paradox gets personal, where it stops being an abstract philosophical puzzle and becomes the most intimate question you'll ever consider. If your body is constantly replacing itself, if the atoms that make up your flesh and bones are temporary residents in the hotel of your being, then what exactly makes you, you? You've probably heard the popular claim that every 7 years, you have a completely new body. It's one of those facts that gets passed around dinner parties and shared in casual conversations, usually with a sense of wonder or disbelief. And while the reality is a bit more nuanced, some cells last longer, some shorter, and a few might stay with you your entire life, the essential truth remains profound. You are not the physical being you were 7 years ago. Let's take a journey through your body, shall we? A gentle tour of this remarkable ship that carries your consciousness. Your stomach lining, subjected to the harsh acids that break down your food, replaces itself every few days. It has to those acids are strong enough to dissolve metal, and your stomach lining takes quite a beating. Your taste buds, those tiny sensors that bring you the pleasure of chocolate or the comfort of warm soup, last only about 2 weeks before they're renewed. Your blood is almost entirely new every few months. Those red blood cells I mentioned, every single one circulating through your body right now, will be gone in 120 days, replaced by fresh cells manufactured in your bone marrow. Your white blood cells, the guardians of your immune system, have lifespans ranging from days to years, depending on their type and function. Even your heart, that most essential and symbolic organ, renews about 1% of its cells each year. It sounds small, but over a lifetime, much of your heart will have been rebuilt, cell by cell, beat by beat. And then there's your brain, your brain. This is where things get particularly interesting for our exploration tonight. For decades, scientists believed that brain cells were different, that the neurons you were born with were the neurons you'd die with. The brain, they thought, was the one part of you that remained constant, the unchanging captain of your ever-changing ship. But we've learned that even this isn't quite true. Your brain, that 3-pound universe nestled inside your skull, is far more dynamic than we ever imagined. While it's true that most of your neurons, those fundamental building blocks of thought and memory, are indeed with you for life, they're not static. They're not unchanging monuments to your past self. Instead, your brain is constantly rewiring itself, constantly adapting, constantly becoming. The connections between your neurons, those synapses where thoughts are born and memories are made, are in perpetual flux. Some strengthen, some weaken, some disappear entirely, and new ones form with each passing moment. Think about learning to ride a bicycle. Remember that moment when balance suddenly clicked, when the wobbling stopped and you found yourself gliding forward with newfound confidence. That moment of learning wasn't just a mental shift, it was a physical rewiring of your brain. New connections formed, new pathways strengthened, new patterns of neural activity emerged, and once formed, these patterns became part of the structure of your mind. But here's what's truly remarkable. This process never stops. Right now, as you listen to these words, new synapses are forming in your brain. The very act of thinking these thoughts, of following this narrative about identity and consciousness, is literally changing the physical structure of your mind. The you who finishes listening to this chapter will have a slightly different brain than the you who began it. Scientists call this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself throughout your life. It's happening when you learn a new language, when you practice a musical instrument, when you navigate a new city for the first time. But it's also happening in quieter moments, when you form a new memory, when you have a conversation with a friend, when you experience something beautiful that moves you. Your synapses are like morning frost, delicate, ephemeral, constantly forming and dissolving based on the temperature of your experiences. Use a pathway frequently, and it strengthens, becomes more permanent. Neglect it, and it fades away, eventually disappearing as if it never existed. This is why childhood memories can seem so vivid one day and slip away the next. It's why skills you don't practice become rusty, why languages you don't speak begin to feel foreign on your tongue. Your brain is not a library where memories sit on shelves, unchanging. It's more like a garden where thoughts and memories must be tended to survive. Imagine, for a moment, that you could shrink down small enough to walk through your brain like a vast cathedral. You'd find yourself in a space more intricate than any human architecture, surrounded by billions of neurons reaching out to each other with delicate, branching extensions called dendrites and axons. These neurons don't quite touch, there are tiny gaps between them called synapses, and it's across these gaps that the whispers of consciousness flow. When you think a thought, when you remember a moment, when you feel an emotion, what you're experiencing is patterns of electrical and chemical signals dancing across these synaptic spaces. Now, here's where it gets beautiful. These connections aren't fixed. They're not like the wiring in your house, installed once and left alone. They're alive, dynamic, responsive to your experiences. When you repeat a thought or action, the synaptic connection involved becomes stronger, more efficient. The neurons literally grow closer together, build more robust connections, create what neuroscientists call long-term potentiation. It's as if the paths in your neural cathedral become more worn, more clearly defined, the more often they're traveled. And paths that aren't used? They fade away, like forest trails that become overgrown when no one walks them. This process is so fundamental to who you are that it's happening right now, as you think about it. The very contemplation of neuroplasticity is triggering neuroplasticity. You're rewiring your brain to better understand brain rewiring. There's something almost poetic about that, isn't there? But this constant renovation raises profound questions about identity. If your brain is always changing, if the very physical structure of your thoughts is in flux, then what gives you continuity? What makes you feel like the same person from day to day, year to year, decade to decade? Some neuroscientists suggest that you might think of your identity as being like a river. The water is always flowing, always changing. No molecule of water that passes a particular point will ever pass that same point again. And yet, the river maintains its essential character. It follows the same banks, flows in the same direction, maintains recognizable patterns and behaviors. Your consciousness might be similar. The specific neural firing patterns that make up your thoughts are constantly changing, but they follow established channels, the patterns of connection that have been strengthened over your lifetime. Your personality, your memories, your way of seeing the world, these emerge from the overall pattern of your neural landscape, even as the individual elements are in constant flux. There's something almost mystical about the way synapses form and disappear. They're so delicate, so responsive to the subtlest changes in your experience. A particularly vivid dream might strengthen certain connections. A moment of deep emotion might forge new pathways that last for years. A period of stress might cause some synapses to weaken or disappear entirely. In many ways, your synapses are more ephemeral than morning frost. Frost, at least, forms according to predictable physical laws. Temperature and humidity create the conditions, and ice crystals follow. But synapses form according to the mysterious alchemy of consciousness itself. They respond to meaning, to emotion, to the ineffable quality of your inner experience. Consider the last time you had a truly meaningful conversation with someone you care about. Maybe it was last week, maybe last year. As you talked, as you shared thoughts and feelings, As you listened and responded, your brains were literally changing. New connections were forming, strengthening, creating physical traces of that shared moment of consciousness. And here's something that might give you pause. Some of those synaptic changes outlasted the conversation itself. Days later, weeks later, your brain still carries the physical imprint of that interaction. In a very real sense, the people we love leave traces of themselves in the structure of our minds. But synapses also disappear with stunning regularity. Every night when you sleep, your brain engages in a process that scientists are only beginning to understand, a kind of neural housekeeping, where unnecessary connections are pruned away. It's as if your mind is a garden, and sleep is the time for removing the weeds and dead growth to make room for new life. This might explain why sleep is so essential for learning and memory. It's not just that your brain needs rest, it's that your brain needs time to decide which new connections are worth keeping and which should be allowed to fade away. The synapses that survive this nightly pruning are the ones that get incorporated into the longer-term structure of your mind. So, in a very literal sense, you wake up each morning with a slightly different brain than the one you went to sleep with. Some connections have been strengthened, others have been weakened or eliminated entirely. You are, quite literally, not exactly the same person you were yesterday. And this brings us to the heart of our poetic paradox. As you've been listening to these words, as you've been following this narrative about identity and change, your brain has been changing. New synapses have formed, existing ones have been strengthened or weakened, and the very structure of your mind has shifted in subtle but real ways. The person who began listening to this chapter, let's call them past you, had a slightly different brain than present you. Past you hadn't yet encountered these particular ideas in quite this way. They hadn't yet formed the new neural pathways that come from contemplating the ship of Theseus in the context of their own biology. They hadn't yet strengthened the connections that come from thinking deeply about neuroplasticity and identity. Present you has all of these new connections, these new patterns of understanding. You've been changed by the experience of learning, of thinking, of wondering. And if you remember these ideas tomorrow, if they influence how you think about yourself and consciousness, then future you will be different still. This isn't meant to be unsettling, quite the opposite, actually. There's something beautiful about the idea that we're all works in progress, that consciousness itself is a dynamic, evolving process rather than a fixed state. You're not trapped by who you were yesterday. You're not limited by the neural patterns you had when you woke up this morning. Every experience is an opportunity for growth, for change, for becoming a slightly different version of yourself. Every conversation, every book, every moment of reflection adds new threads to the tapestry of your consciousness. You are constantly becoming yourself, in the most literal sense possible. But this raises fascinating questions about brain uploading, doesn't it? If your brain is constantly changing, if your identity is more like a river than a statue, then which version of you would be uploaded? The you from this moment? The you from yesterday? The you from next week? And if consciousness is fundamentally about patterns and connections rather than specific physical substrates, then perhaps the question isn't whether an uploaded mind would be made of the same stuff as your current brain. Perhaps the question is whether it would maintain the same patterns, the same dynamic flow of thoughts and experiences that make you uniquely you. Think about it this way. Your brain is already a kind of biological computer, processing information through patterns of electrical and chemical activity. Every thought you think, every memory you recall, every emotion you feel is ultimately a pattern of neural firing. Your consciousness doesn't depend on any particular atom or molecule in your brain, it emerges from the relationships between them, the connections and patterns that have formed over your lifetime. So when we talk about uploading consciousness, we're really talking about capturing and reproducing these patterns. We're talking about preserving the river of your mind, not the particular water molecules that happen to be flowing through it at any given moment. But can patterns of consciousness exist independently of biological brains? Can the river of mind flow through silicon channels instead of neural pathways? These are the questions that will guide us through the rest of our journey together. Let's take a moment here to let these ideas settle, like snow falling gently on a quiet landscape. We've covered some profound territory together, the ancient puzzle of identity, the remarkable dynamism of your brain, the poetic paradox of being yourself while constantly changing. I imagine some of you might be feeling a bit like you're floating in philosophical space right now, untethered from your usual certainties about selfhood and identity. That's perfectly natural. These are big ideas, the kind that can make you feel slightly dizzy if you contemplate them too deeply all at once. But there's also something liberating in all of this, isn't there? The realization that you're not stuck being exactly who you've always been. The understanding that change isn't just something that happens to you, it's something that is you, fundamentally and essentially. Your identity isn't a destination you've arrived at. It's a journey you're taking, step by step, thought by thought, experience by experience. And every moment offers the possibility of becoming someone slightly new, someone slightly more than you were before. So let me ask you this. As we prepare to continue our exploration together, what feels most essentially you right now? Is it your memories, those neural patterns that have been strengthened through repetition and emotion? Is it your thoughts, the current flow of consciousness moving through your mind? Is it your body, this remarkable biological ship that carries your awareness through the world? Or is it something else entirely, something that transcends the physical, something that emerges from the dance between mind and matter, but isn't reducible to either one? Don't worry if you don't have an answer right now. These aren't the kind of questions that resolve themselves quickly or easily. They're companions for a lifetime of wondering, friends to keep you company during those quiet moments when the world feels most mysterious and beautiful. What I hope you're beginning to sense, though, is that the question of uploading consciousness isn't just about future technology or scientific possibility. It's about the deepest mysteries of what it means to be human, what it means to be you. It's about the relationship between mind and matter, between pattern and substance, between the self you are and the selves you might become. And as we continue our journey together through these ideas, as we explore the technical challenges and philosophical puzzles that surround consciousness uploading, remember that we're not just talking about some distant future scenario. We're talking about the nature of your own mind, right here, right now, in this very moment. You are the ship of Theseus, constantly rebuilding yourself while remaining essentially you. You are a river of consciousness, always flowing, always changing, always recognizably yourself. You are a pattern in the vast symphony of existence, unique and irreplaceable, and endlessly becoming. And in that becoming, in that constant dance of change and continuity, lies both the challenge and the profound beauty of what it means to be conscious, to be alive, to be wonderfully, mysteriously, undeniably you. Now that we've explored the beautiful paradox of your ever-changing self, let's embark on perhaps the most extraordinary journey you'll ever take a voyage through the cathedral of your own consciousness. Close your eyes for a moment, if you're comfortable doing so, and imagine that you could shrink yourself down to the size of a single thought, small enough to walk through the vast landscape of your mind. What would you find there, do you think? What would it feel like to stand at the threshold of consciousness itself, to witness firsthand the place where your thoughts are born, where your memories live, where the ineffable sense of being you emerges from the dance of matter and energy? The first thing that might strike you is the sheer scale of it all. Your brain, nestled so comfortably inside your skull that you rarely think about its physical presence, contains roughly 86 billion neurons. 86 billion. To put that number in perspective, there are more neurons in your head right now than there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. You are, quite literally, carrying a universe inside your skull. But it's not just the number that's breathtaking, it's the complexity of their connections. Each of those 86 billion neurons reaches out to others with delicate, branching extensions, forming somewhere between 100 trillion and 1,000 trillion synaptic connections. The exact number varies from person to person, and indeed changes throughout your lifetime, but even the lower estimate is staggering. If you could somehow count one connection per second, working day and night without rest, it would take you over 3 million years to count them all. 3 million years. The entire history of our species, from the first stone tools to the words you're hearing now, represents just a fraction of the counting time it would take to enumerate the connections in a single human brain. As you wander through this neural landscape, shrunk down to witness its architecture firsthand, you might find that neurons remind you of nothing so much as ancient trees in a vast primordial forest. Each neuron has a cell body, like the trunk of a tree, from which extend countless branches, the dendrites that receive signals from other neurons. and the axon that sends signals onward. Some of these neural trees are magnificent giants, their axons stretching incredible distances across the landscape of your mind. The motor neurons that control the muscles in your toes, for instance, have axons that extend all the way from your spinal cord down through your legs, a journey of nearly 3 feet at the cellular level, equivalent to a tree trunk that stretches for miles. Others are smaller, more delicate, like the intricate shrubs that grow in the understory of a forest. The neurons in your cerebral cortex, where much of your conscious thinking takes place, are densely packed and heavily interconnected, their branches interweaving in patterns so complex that no computer has ever successfully mapped them all. And like trees in a forest, these neurons don't exist in isolation. They form communities, neighborhoods, entire ecosystems of consciousness. In your visual cortex, neurons specialize in detecting edges, colors, movements, faces. In your hippocampus, they work together to form and retrieve memories. In your prefrontal cortex, they engage in the complex orchestra of decision-making, planning, and abstract thought. But here's where the metaphor becomes even more beautiful. Unlike trees in a forest, which communicate slowly through chemical signals in the soil, your neurons talk to each other at the speed of lightning. Electrical impulses race along their axons at speeds up to 120 meters per second, carrying messages that bridge the gap between intention and action, between perception and understanding, between one moment of consciousness and the next. So there you are, wandering through this neural forest, small enough to walk between the towering dendrites, to witness the synaptic connections crackling with electrical activity like aurora borealis playing between the branches. What would you see? What would it feel like to be present at the moment a memory forms, or a decision crystallizes, or a creative insight suddenly illuminates the landscape of mind? You might notice that different regions have their own distinct character, their own neural architecture. In the cerebellum, that ancient part of your brain responsible for balance and coordination, the neurons are arranged with almost crystalline precision, like a vast three-dimensional lattice. Purkinje cells, with their elaborate branching patterns, look like coral formations in an underwater garden, each one receiving inputs from hundreds of thousands of other neurons. Move forward into the hippocampus, and the architecture shifts dramatically. Here, in the brain's primary memory center, neurons are arranged in curved layers that early anatomists thought resembled a seahorse, hence the name, from the Greek words for horse and sea monster. But if you could walk through it at neural scale, it might feel more like wandering through the galleries of an infinite library, where memories are constantly being filed, cross-referenced, and retrieved. And in the neocortex, that wrinkled outer layer where much of your conscious experience unfolds, you'd find yourself in a 6-layered city of mind. Each layer has its own character, its own population of neural citizens. Layer 4 bustles with activity as sensory information streams in from the outside world. Layer 5 houses the grand pyramidal neurons, their axons reaching out to other brain regions like highways connecting distant cities. Layer 6 whispers back to the thalamus, modulating the flow of information in an endless feedback loop of consciousness. But perhaps the most remarkable thing you'd witness in your neural wanderings is the constant activity. Even when you think your mind is at rest, even in the quiet moments before sleep, your brain is alive with electrical activity. Waves of neural firing sweep across the cortex like wind across a wheat field. Networks of neurons synchronize their activity, creating rhythms and patterns that we're only beginning to understand. Let's pause for a moment to really contemplate what these numbers mean. 86 billion neurons. If each neuron were a person, you'd have a population nearly 12 times larger than the entire human race living inside your skull. And each of these neural people is connected to thousands of others, creating a network of relationships so complex that it makes the entire internet look simple by comparison. In fact, if we wanted to map all the connections in a single human brain with the same precision that we map the internet, we'd need to trace not just which neurons connect to which other neurons, but the strength of each connection, how it changes over time, how it responds to different types of signals. We'd need to understand not just the anatomy but the physiology, not just the structure but the function. It's worth noting that this incredible complexity emerges from relatively simple building blocks. Neurons, for all their sophistication, are still just cells. They have the same basic components as the cells in your liver or your skin: a cell membrane, a nucleus containing DNA, mitochondria for energy production. What makes them special is their shape, their connections, and most mysteriously of all, their ability to generate and transmit electrical signals. Each neuron is like a tiny biological computer, constantly processing inputs from its thousands of neighbors and deciding whether to pass the signal along. But unlike the digital computers we're familiar with, which deal in simple on-off states, neurons operate in a rich analog world of gradations and nuances. The strength of a synaptic connection can vary continuously. The timing of signals matters. The history of recent activity influences how a neuron responds to new inputs. And here's something that might give you pause. Right now, as you listen to these words, billions of these neural computations are happening every second in your brain. Billions of tiny decisions, billions of signal integrations, billions of moments where one neuron decides whether to fire and pass its message along to its neighbors. You are not just thinking thoughts, you are the thoughts, emerging from this vast parallel processing system of unprecedented complexity and beauty. Given this incredible complexity, you might wonder how scientists even begin to approach the task of mapping a brain. How do you create a detailed map of something so intricate, so dynamic, so fundamentally mysterious? The answer is, very carefully, and with a great deal of humility. In recent decades, neuroscientists have launched what may be the most ambitious mapping project in the history of science, the Human Connectome Project. The name is deliberately evocative. Just as the Human Genome Project sought to map every gene in our DNA, the Connectome Project aims to map every connection in the human brain. But where the Genome Project dealt with a relatively linear sequence of chemical bases challenging but conceptually straightforward, the Connectome Project faces the daunting task of mapping a three-dimensional network of unprecedented complexity. It's not just that there are so many connections to map, though that's certainly part of the challenge. It's that these connections are constantly changing, and their function depends not just on their existence, but on their strength, their timing, their context. Imagine you're an alien anthropologist who has just discovered Earth, and you want to understand human civilization. You might start by trying to map our cities where the buildings are, which roads connect to which other roads, how information and people flow through the urban landscape. But mapping a city is relatively straightforward compared to mapping a brain. Cities are built on a two-dimensional surface, with roads that stay where they're built and buildings that don't constantly reshape themselves. The brain, by contrast, is a three-dimensional network where the roads, the neural connections, can strengthen or weaken based on use, where new connections can form and old ones can disappear, where the same pathway might carry completely different information depending on the context. The Human Connectome Project represents our best current attempt to create detailed maps of this neural landscape. Using advanced brain imaging techniques, technologies with names like diffusion, tensor imaging, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, researchers are slowly, painstakingly tracing the major highways and local roads of human consciousness. They've made remarkable progress. We now have detailed maps of how different brain regions connect to each other in the typical human brain. We can see the great superhighways of neural traffic, the corpus callosum that connects the left and right hemispheres, the massive fiber bundles that carry information between the cortex and deeper brain structures. We're beginning to understand how these connection patterns vary from person to person, and how they change throughout development and aging. We can even see how certain diseases and conditions alter the brain's connectivity patterns, providing insights into everything from autism to Alzheimer's disease. But, and this is a crucial, but we're still nowhere close to mapping individual synapses, those microscopic connections where thoughts actually happen. The resolution of our best current brain imaging techniques is like trying to map the internet by looking at satellite photos of cities. You can see the major data centers and fiber optic cables, but you can't see the individual computers or trace the path of a specific email. To truly map consciousness, to create the kind of detailed blueprint that would be necessary for uploading a brain, we'd need to trace every single synaptic connection with perfect precision. We'd need to know not just that neuron A connects to neuron B, but exactly how strong that connection is, how it responds to different types of signals, how it's changed over the course of your lifetime. Let me put this challenge in perspective. The most detailed neural map ever created is of a tiny roundworm called C. elegans, which has exactly 302 neurons and about 7,000 synaptic connections. It took researchers decades to map this microscopic nervous system completely. Your brain has roughly 300,000 times more neurons and perhaps 10 million times more connections. If we could map human neural connections at the same rate we mapped C. elegans, it would take hundreds of thousands of years to complete a single human connectome. And that's assuming the brain stayed perfectly still and unchanged during the mapping process, which, as we've learned, it most certainly does not. But the challenge isn't just about scale and time. It's about the fundamental nature of what we're trying to map. A static map of neural connections might be like having a photograph of a river. It tells you something about the structure, but it misses the most essential feature, the flow. Perhaps the most poetic way to understand the challenge of brain mapping is this. Imagine you're trying to map every conversation in a city of 10 million people. Not just who talks to whom, but what they say, when they say it, how loudly they speak, how their conversations change based on the time of day, the weather, their mood, their memories of previous conversations. And imagine that these conversations are happening not in a human language you can understand, but in whispers so quiet you need the most sensitive equipment just to detect them. Imagine that the speakers move around constantly, that they form new relationships and abandon old ones, that the meaning of their words depends not just on what they say, but on the entire history of their previous interactions. This is what scientists face when they try to map the brain. Every neuron is engaged in constant conversation with thousands of its neighbors, speaking in a language of electrical and chemical signals that we're only beginning to decode. The words in this neural language are action potentials, brief electrical spikes that last just a few milliseconds. The sentences are patterns of spikes across multiple neurons. The meaning emerges from the complex interplay of timing, strength, and context. And unlike our imaginary city of human conversations, where people speak one at a time and pauses create natural boundaries between thoughts, neural conversations are massively parallel. Millions of neurons can be speaking simultaneously, their signals overlapping and interfering, and combining in ways that create new meanings, new possibilities, new moments of consciousness. To map this completely, we'd need to record from every neuron simultaneously, with perfect temporal precision, for long enough to understand how the patterns change over time. We'd need to capture not just the structure but the function, not just the anatomy but the physiology, not just the hardware but the software of consciousness. This brings us to perhaps the most fundamental question of all. When we talk about uploading consciousness, what exactly are we trying to copy? Is it the physical structure of the brain, every neuron, every synapse, every molecular detail? Or is it something more abstract, the patterns of activity, the information processing, the functional relationships between different brain regions? Consider this analogy. Imagine you want to copy a symphony. Do you need to replicate every molecule in the concert hall, every fiber in the musician's clothing, every atom in their instruments? Or do you just need to capture the pattern of sound waves, the relationships between notes, the temporal structure that creates musical meaning? Most people would say that the essence of a symphony lies not in its physical substrate, but in its informational content, the score, the performance, the pattern of organized sound that creates beauty and meaning. But consciousness might be more complicated than music. It might depend not just on patterns of activity, but on the specific biological processes that generate those patterns. Neuroscientists often talk about the difference between the brain's structure and its function. Structure refers to the physical anatomy which neurons exist, how they're connected, what shape they have. Function refers to the dynamic activity, how signals flow through the network, how information is processed, how behavior emerges from neural activity. In some ways, structure and function are intimately connected. The structure of your visual cortex, the way neurons are organized into columns that respond to different orientations and directions of movement, directly enables the function of vision. Change the structure, and you change the function. But in other ways, function can be surprisingly independent of specific structural details. Your brain can lose entire regions to injury or disease, and still maintain many of its functions by reorganizing, by finding new pathways, by adapting in ways that would be impossible if consciousness were rigidly tied to specific anatomical structures. This raises profound questions for consciousness uploading. Would an uploaded mind need to replicate every structural detail of your brain, every dendritic branch, every synaptic vesicle, every glial cell? Or would it be sufficient to capture the functional patterns, the information processing algorithms that emerge from but might not be rigidly dependent on biological implementation? Some researchers believe that consciousness is substrate independent, that it could, in principle, run on silicon just as well as on biological neurons, as long as the functional relationships are preserved. Others argue that consciousness depends on specific features of biological computation that can't be replicated in digital systems. Where do your memories live? It's such a simple question, but it touches on some of the deepest mysteries of neuroscience and philosophy. When you remember your first day of school, or the taste of your grandmother's cookies, or the face of someone you love, what exactly is happening in your brain? The traditional view is that memories are stored in the strength and pattern of synaptic connections. When you learn something new, certain synapses become stronger, creating a physical trace of the experience in your brain's structure. When you recall that memory later, you're reactivating the same pattern of connections, literally re-experiencing the neural activity that occurred during the original event. This view suggests that uploading memories would be a matter of precisely mapping and replicating synaptic strengths throughout the brain. If we could capture the exact pattern of connections that encode your childhood memories, your learned skills, your emotional associations, then we could, in theory, recreate those memories in a digital system. But recent research has complicated this picture considerably. We now know that memory isn't just about storage, it's about reconstruction. Every time you recall a memory, you don't just retrieve a static file from your brain's hard drive. Instead, you actively reconstruct the memory from various pieces of information scattered throughout your neural network. And here's something even more surprising. The act of remembering can actually change the memory. Each time you recall an experience, the neural pathways involved are subtly modified, updated with new information from your current context. Your memory of your first day of school today is not exactly the same as your memory of that day was 10 years ago, even if you're not consciously aware of the changes. This brings us to perhaps the most mysterious aspect of consciousness, its apparent unity. Despite arising from the activity of billions of separate neurons, your conscious experience feels seamless, integrated, whole. You don't experience 86 billion separate thoughts, you experience one flowing stream of consciousness that somehow emerges from all that neural complexity. How does this unity arise? How do billions of individual neural computations combine to create a single, coherent sense of self? This is what philosophers call the binding problem, the question of how separate pieces of information get bound together into unified conscious experiences. Consider what's happening right now as you listen to these words. Your auditory system is processing the sound waves, breaking them down into different frequencies and patterns. Your language centers are parsing the words, extracting meaning from syntax and semantics. Your memory systems are connecting these new ideas to things you already know. Your emotional systems are responding to the content and tone. Your attention systems are filtering out distractions and focusing on the narrative. All of these processes are happening in different parts of your brain, at different timescales, using different types of neural computation. And yet, your experience is not fragmented into separate auditory, linguistic, memorial, emotional, and attentional components. Instead, you experience a single, unified stream of understanding. This unity suggests that consciousness might be more than just the sum of its neural parts. It might be an emergent property, something that arises from the complex interactions between brain systems, but can't be reduced to any single system or mechanism. If this is true, then uploading consciousness might require more than just copying individual neurons, or even copying the overall pattern of neural connections. It might require replicating the emergent properties themselves, the mysterious alchemy by which separate information processing systems combine to create unified conscious experience. Let's pause here for a moment. In this vast cathedral of consciousness we've been exploring together. Take a breath, a slow, deep breath, and let your awareness settle into this present moment. Right now, as you listen to these words, as you contemplate these ideas about the brain and consciousness, something truly extraordinary is happening inside your skull. Billions of neurons are firing in precisely coordinated patterns. Electrical signals are racing along neural highways at incredible speeds. Chemical messages are flowing across synaptic gaps, creating new connections and strengthening old ones. The very act of understanding what I'm saying to you, the process of turning sound waves or written symbols into meaning, into imagery, into wonder, represents one of the most complex information processing tasks in the known universe. And it's happening effortlessly, automatically, as naturally as breathing. Can you feel it? Not the individual neurons firing, of course they're far too small and fast for conscious awareness. But can you sense the quiet miracle of mind itself? The way thoughts arise and flow and transform into new thoughts? The way understanding emerges from the dance of matter and energy in the 3 pounds of tissue nestled inside your skull? There's something almost sacred about this, isn't there? The realization that consciousness, your consciousness, unique and irreplaceable, emerges from the most complex structure we know of in the universe. You are not just observing the cosmos, you are a way the cosmos has developed to observe itself. And yet, for all its complexity, for all its beauty, your brain is still made of ordinary matter. The neurons that generate your thoughts are built from the same carbon and hydrogen and oxygen atoms that make up the air you breathe and the water you drink. The electrical signals that carry your consciousness are governed by the same physical laws that power your smartphone and light your room. This raises the most profound question of all. If consciousness can emerge from ordinary matter organized in sufficiently complex ways, then why couldn't it emerge from silicon and electricity organized in similarly complex patterns? Why couldn't the river of mind flow through digital channels just as easily as through biological ones? These are the questions that will guide us as we continue our journey together. Questions about the nature of consciousness itself, about the relationship between mind and matter, about what it might mean to preserve the pattern of a mind beyond the biology that gave it birth. But for now, simply rest in the wonder of it all. Rest in the miracle of being conscious, of being aware, of being a universe that has somehow learned to contemplate itself. Whether that miracle could be preserved in silicon and code remains to be seen. But that it exists at all, right here, right now, in this very moment of your listening, that is already more extraordinary than any science fiction could imagine. There's something almost magical about the way a single scent can transport you across decades in an instant. The smell of baking bread might suddenly carry you back to your grandmother's kitchen on a Sunday morning. The fragrance of rain on warm pavement could resurrect a summer afternoon from your childhood with startling vividness. These moments of involuntary memory feel like time travel, don't they? As if the past isn't really past at all, but somehow stored within us, waiting for the right key to unlock it. But where exactly do these memories live? When neuroscientists peer into the brain with their most sophisticated instruments, when they map the neural networks that light up during remembering, what do they find? The answer is both simpler and more mysterious than you might expect. Your memories don't exist in any single place in your brain, like books on a shelf or files in a folder. Instead, they live as patterns, intricate, distributed patterns of connections between neurons that span multiple brain regions. When you remember your first kiss, you're not accessing a single memory file. You're reactivating a complex network that includes the visual cortex recreating the face you saw, the somatosensory cortex reviving the sensation of touch, the emotional centers rekindling the feelings of excitement or nervousness, the hippocampus weaving all these elements together into a coherent narrative. Your first kiss exists somewhere in the gentle firing of neurons scattered throughout your brain, not as a thing, but as a pattern, not as a storage location, but as a dance of electrical activity that, when performed in just the right way, recreates the subjective experience of that moment. It's as if your brain contains not photographs of the past, but instructions for how to reconstruct past experiences from the raw materials of consciousness. Think of memory like a vast garden where pathways are worn into the earth by repeated walking. The more often you travel a particular route, the more frequently you recall a specific memory, the deeper and more defined that pathway becomes. Neglected paths gradually fade, becoming overgrown with the metaphorical vegetation of forgetting, while well-traveled routes remain clear and easily navigated. But unlike garden paths, which exist in the physical world as permanent alterations to the landscape, memory pathways exist as dynamic patterns of connectivity between neurons. They're not carved in stone. They're more like melodies that exist only when played, like dances that exist only in the dancing. When you form a new memory, let's say you're learning the name of someone you've just met, your brain doesn't simply write that information into an empty storage slot. Instead, it weaves the new information into the existing tapestry of your knowledge and experience. The name might get connected to the visual appearance of the person's face, to the sound of their voice, to the context where you met them, to other people they remind you of, to the emotions you felt during the encounter. This distributed, interconnected nature of memory storage is both a marvel of efficiency and a source of profound confusion for those trying to understand how memories might be transferred from biological brains to digital systems. Because if memories exist as patterns rather than files, if they're woven into the very fabric of neural connectivity, then copying them would require not just mapping the brain's structure, but understanding the subtle dynamics of how these patterns emerge, persist, and change over time. Not all memories are created equal, and this distinction becomes crucial when we consider the possibility of uploading consciousness. Neuroscientists distinguish between two fundamentally different types of memory: explicit and implicit. Explicit memories are the ones you can consciously recall and describe your memories of specific events, facts you've learned, faces you recognize. These are stored primarily in the hippocampus and related structures, and they're the kind of memories we usually think about when we use the word memory in everyday conversation. Implicit memories, on the other hand, are more like skills embedded in your neural circuitry: how to ride a bicycle, how to tie your shoes, how to recognize the emotional tone in someone's voice. These memories live primarily in other brain regions: the cerebellum for motor skills, the amygdala for emotional associations, the basal ganglia for habits and procedures. Here's what makes this distinction so important for consciousness uploading. Explicit memories feel like information that could, in principle, be transferred from one system to another. If you can consciously access a memory and describe it in words, it seems reasonable to imagine that a sufficiently advanced computer might be able to store and retrieve the same information. But implicit memories are trickier. They're not really information in the traditional sense. They're more like learned patterns of response, ingrained ways of being that have become part of your neural architecture. The way you instinctively duck when something flies toward your head. The way your hand knows exactly how much pressure to apply when signing your name. The way you can instantly sense whether someone is being sarcastic. These capacities emerge from years of experience that have literally reshaped your brain's connectivity. Could these implicit memories be transferred to a digital system? It's not just a matter of copying information. It's a matter of recreating the entire embodied history that gave rise to these learned responses. And since many of these memories are tied to the specific characteristics of your biological body, their transfer might require not just a digital brain, but a digital body as well. Let's return to that first kiss for a moment, because it illustrates something beautiful about the nature of memory. That moment, whenever and wherever it happened, exists now only as a pattern of potential neural firing. The lips that were kissed have long since replaced all their cells. The hands that trembled with nervousness are made of entirely different atoms than they were then. Even the neurons that encoded the experience have been modified countless times by subsequent experiences. And yet, in some very real sense, that moment persists. It lives on as a set of instructions written in the language of synaptic connections, a recipe for recreating the subjective experience of that first touch of lips, that first rush of romantic connection. But here's what's particularly fascinating. Every time you remember that first kiss, you're not just passively retrieving a stored file. You're actively reconstructing the experience from scattered neural fragments. And each reconstruction is subtly different. Your memory of the event today is not identical to your memory of it a year ago or 10 years ago. It's been influenced by every subsequent kiss, every romantic experience, every change in your understanding of love and intimacy. This reconstructive nature of memory raises profound questions about consciousness uploading. If we could somehow capture and transfer the neural patterns that encode your memories, would we be transferring your actual memories, or would we be transferring your brain's current best reconstruction of what those memories might have been? And perhaps more importantly, would it matter? If the uploaded version of you could access patterns that generated experiences indistinguishable from your current memories, would the fact that they were reconstructions rather than originals make any difference to the continuity of your conscious experience? It's natural, when thinking about uploading consciousness, to imagine the brain as a kind of biological computer. After all, both brains and computers process information, both use electrical signals, both can store and retrieve data. The metaphor is so compelling that it's shaped decades of neuroscience research and dominates popular discussions of consciousness and artificial intelligence. But the more we learn about how brains actually work, the more apparent it becomes that the computer metaphor, while useful, is also deeply limited. Your brain is not actually very much like the computer you're probably familiar with, and understanding these differences is crucial for thinking clearly about consciousness uploading. Digital computers operate by manipulating discrete symbols according to precise rules. Information is stored as exact patterns of ones and zeros, and processing occurs through logical operations that always produce the same output given the same input. This digital precision is part of what makes computers so powerful for certain tasks. They never make arithmetic errors, they never forget where they stored a file, and they can execute millions of identical operations without variation or fatigue. Your brain, by contrast, is fundamentally analog. It deals not in precise digital values, but in continuous gradations of electrical and chemical activity. The strength of a synaptic connection isn't simply on or off. It exists along a continuum, and that strength can vary based on the neuron's recent history, the chemical environment, the time of day, your emotional state, and countless other factors. This analog nature of neural computation creates both amazing capabilities and significant challenges for consciousness uploading. On the capabilities side, it allows your brain to be incredibly flexible and adaptive. When you recognize your friend's face in a crowd, you're not matching a stored template, you're performing a complex pattern recognition task that works even when the lighting is different, the angle is unfamiliar, or your friend has a new haircut. A digital computer programmed to recognize faces typically needs to be trained on thousands of examples and still struggles with variations that would be effortless for you. Your brain's analog processing allows it to generalize, to see the essential patterns that persist across variations, to make the kind of intuitive leaps that we associate with understanding and insight, but this flexibility comes at a cost. Unlike digital computers, which can copy information perfectly from one location to another, analog systems are inherently noisy. Each time a signal passes through a neural circuit, it's subtly altered by random fluctuations in the cellular machinery. These alterations are usually tiny and inconsequential, but they accumulate over time, contributing to the gradual evolution of memories and the unique trajectory of each individual's mental development. This raises a fascinating question for consciousness uploading. Would a digital recreation of an analog brain need to include the noise, the random fluctuations, the imperfections that are actually essential to how biological brains learn and adapt? Or could consciousness be preserved in a more perfect, more precise digital form? Consider how you recognize the emotion in someone's voice. When a friend says, "I'm fine," in a way that clearly communicates they're anything but fine, you're picking up on subtle variations in tone, timing, and inflection that would be nearly impossible to specify precisely. The sadness isn't encoded in any particular frequency or volume level. It emerges from the complex interplay of multiple acoustic features processed by neural circuits that have learned to detect these patterns through years of social experience. This kind of nuanced, context-dependent processing is where analog systems truly shine. Your brain doesn't analyze speech by breaking it down into discrete digital samples and applying mathematical transforms. Instead, it uses networks of neurons that resonate with different acoustic patterns, that fire more or less strongly depending on how well the input matches their learned preferences. The implications for consciousness uploading are significant. If consciousness depends on this kind of analog processing, on the subtle, continuous variations that allow for flexibility and nuance, then creating a digital version might require not just mapping the brain's connections, but finding ways to preserve the analog nature of neural computation in a fundamentally digital medium. Some researchers believe this is possible, that digital systems could simulate analog processing with sufficient precision to preserve the essential features of consciousness. Others argue that the analog aspects of brain function are so fundamental that consciousness simply cannot be translated into digital form without losing something essential. There's something wonderfully chaotic about the way your brain actually works. Unlike the clean, predictable operation of digital computers, neural processing is gloriously messy. Neurotransmitters leak across synaptic gaps in ways that aren't perfectly controlled. The same neuron might respond differently to identical inputs depending on its metabolic state. Networks of neurons can exhibit complex, seemingly random fluctuations that somehow contribute to the stability and flexibility of overall brain function. This messiness isn't a bug, it's a feature. The random variations, the noise, the imperfections are actually essential to how biological brains learn, adapt, and generate creative insights. When you have a sudden flash of inspiration, when you make an unexpected connection between seemingly unrelated ideas, you're experiencing the beneficial effects of neural noise, random fluctuations that occasionally push your brain into new patterns of activity. But biological messiness extends far beyond the brain itself. Your consciousness doesn't exist in isolation, it's intimately connected to your body, to the constant flow of hormones and neurotransmitters, to the rhythm of your heartbeat and the pattern of your breathing. These bodily influences shape your thoughts and emotions in ways that are only beginning to be understood. When you feel nervous before an important presentation, your racing heart isn't just a side effect of anxiety, it's actually contributing to the anxiety itself, sending signals to your brain that reinforce the emotional state. When you feel calm and peaceful after a good meal, the satisfaction isn't purely psychological, it's partly the result of hormonal signals from your digestive system that directly influence your brain's emotional centers. This brings us to one of the most challenging aspects of consciousness uploading, the question of what might be lost in the translation from biological to digital existence. Even if we could perfectly map every neuron and every synapse, even if we could recreate the exact patterns of connectivity that give rise to your thoughts and memories, would the resulting digital consciousness be truly equivalent to the biological original? Consider the role of your body in shaping your conscious experience. Your brain didn't evolve in isolation, it evolved as part of an integrated biological system that includes not just neurons but hormones, neurotransmitters, immune cells, gut bacteria, and countless other biological factors that influence mood, cognition, and behavior. When you feel happy, sadness, fear, or love, these emotions aren't generated purely by neural computation. They emerge from the complex interaction between your brain and your body's chemical environment. Happiness correlates with increased levels of serotonin and dopamine. Fear involves the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Love is associated with oxytocin and vasopressin. These chemical influences are so fundamental to emotional experience that altering them through medication, diet, exercise, or disease can dramatically change personality, mood, and behavior. Would a digital consciousness, lacking this complex chemical environment, be capable of experiencing emotions in the same way? Or would emotional experience be fundamentally different in the absence of biological chemistry? Let's think about a specific type of memory that illustrates this challenge particularly well. Emotional memories. When you remember a moment of profound joy or devastating loss, you're not just recalling factual information about what happened. You're re-experiencing, to some degree, the emotional state that accompanied the original event. This emotional component of memory isn't just neural, it's deeply biological. The memory of fear includes not just the cognitive recognition that something was frightening, but the bodily sensation of fear, the increased heart rate, the surge of adrenaline, the heightened alertness. The memory of love includes not just the intellectual understanding that you cared about someone, but the warm, expansive feeling that accompanied that caring. These bodily components of emotional memory are mediated by complex interactions between the brain and the endocrine system. When you recall a frightening experience, your brain doesn't just reactivate the neural patterns associated with fear, it also triggers the release of stress hormones that recreate, in milder form, the physiological state of the original experience. Would a digital consciousness, lacking hormones and neurotransmitters, be able to form and recall emotional memories in the same way? Could silicon circuits generate the subjective feeling of fear without adrenaline, or the warmth of love without oxytocin? These aren't just technical questions, they go to the heart of what it means to be conscious, to experience emotions, to be fully human. Your consciousness exists in a constant bath of chemical influences that most of us rarely think about. Right now, as you listen to these words, the quality of your attention, the nature of your mood, Your overall sense of well-being are all being influenced by dozens of different chemical messengers circulating through your brain and body. Dopamine affects your motivation and sense of reward. Serotonin influences your mood and social behavior. GABA regulates anxiety and helps you stay calm. Acetylcholine modulates attention and learning. The list goes on and on. Your brain contains dozens of different neurotransmitter systems, each contributing to the overall symphony of consciousness. But these chemical influences aren't just background factors, they're integral to who you are. Your personality, your emotional responses, your characteristic ways of thinking and feeling are all shaped by the particular balance of neurotransmitters in your brain. People with naturally higher levels of dopamine tend to be more motivated and reward-seeking. Those with different serotonin levels may be more or less prone to depression or anxiety. This raises a profound question for consciousness uploading. How would these chemical influences be translated into digital form? Would an uploaded consciousness need to include simulated neurotransmitter systems? Would digital dopamine and serotonin be functionally equivalent to their biological counterparts? Or would the absence of these chemical influences result in a fundamentally different type of consciousness? Here's a question that gets to the heart of embodied consciousness. Could a digital version of you still feel homesick for autumn afternoons? Could it experience the particular melancholy that comes with the first cold morning of winter, or the expansive joy of a perfect spring day? These emotional responses to seasonal changes aren't just learned associations or cultural constructs. They're rooted in deep biological rhythms that connect your consciousness to the natural world. The changing length of days affects your brain's production of melatonin, influencing your sleep patterns and mood. The quality of light triggers responses in your circadian rhythm system. Even the smell of autumn leaves or spring flowers can trigger powerful emotional responses mediated by the direct connection between your olfactory system and your brain's emotional centers. A digital consciousness might have access to all your memories of autumn afternoons, might be able to describe in perfect detail the way the light slants through falling leaves or the crisp feeling of cool air. But would it feel the same embodied connection to these experiences? Would it experience the particular type of nostalgia that comes from being a biological creature attuned to natural rhythms? This isn't just a question about sensory experience, it's a question about whether consciousness can be fully separated from the biological context in which it evolved. We are creatures of the earth, shaped by millions of years of evolution in environments with day and night cycles, seasonal changes, gravity, weather. Our consciousness bears the imprint of this evolutionary history in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Let's pause here for a moment. In this digital garden of memory we've been exploring together. We've wandered through questions about how memories might be transferred, about the differences between biological and digital processing, about the role of the body in shaping consciousness. These aren't just academic questions, are they? They touch on some of the deepest mysteries of what it means to be human. When we ask whether a digital consciousness could experience emotions the same way you do, we're really asking what emotions are, where they come from, what makes them real and meaningful. Right now, take a moment to notice your own embodied consciousness. Feel the weight of your body where you're sitting or lying. Notice you're breathing the automatic rise and fall of your chest, the way oxygen flows into your lungs and nourishes your brain. Pay attention to any emotions that might be present, not just the major feelings, but the subtle background moods, the quiet contentment or mild restlessness that color your experience. All of this rich, complex, embodied awareness emerges from the interaction between your brain and your body, between your nervous system and your chemical environment, between your consciousness and the biological vessel that carries it through the world. What would it mean to preserve this experience in digital form? Not just the memories and thoughts and cognitive patterns, but the full richness of embodied consciousness. The way your mood shifts with the weather, the way your thinking becomes clearer after exercise, the way certain foods or scents can transport you instantly to other times and places. These experiential qualities of consciousness might be the hardest things to translate into digital form. They emerge from the complex interplay between mind and body, between neural computation and biological chemistry, between the patterns of your thoughts and the rhythms of your physiology. And yet, there's something profound to consider. Even now, in your biological brain, these experiences exist as patterns of neural activity. The feeling of homesickness, the emotion of love, the sensation of beauty, All of these emerge from the dynamic flow of electrical and chemical signals through your neural networks. If consciousness is ultimately about patterns rather than particular physical substrates, then perhaps these experiential qualities could be preserved in digital form, even if they would need to be implemented very differently than they are in biological brains. This brings us to one of the most poetic questions about digital consciousness. Would an uploaded mind dream? And if so, what would those dreams be like? Dreams represent consciousness at its most mysterious. During REM sleep, your brain generates vivid, often bizarre experiences that feel completely real while you're experiencing them. You visit impossible places, meet people who couldn't exist, experience emotions that might be entirely disconnected from your waking concerns. Dreaming seems to serve important functions for biological brains, consolidating memories, processing emotions, perhaps even exploring possible futures or creative solutions to problems. But dreams also depend on specific patterns of brain activity that occur during sleep, patterns that are influenced by neurotransmitters, hormones, and the natural rhythms of biological rest. Would a digital consciousness need to sleep? Would it have REM cycles? Would it generate the kind of spontaneous, surreal narratives that characterize human dreams? Or would digital consciousness be always awake, always rational, lacking the strange poetry of the dreaming mind? The question of digital dreams touches on something essential about consciousness itself. Dreams remind us that our minds are not just rational information processing systems, they're creative, meaning-making entities that generate experiences even in the absence of external input. They show us that consciousness is not just about thinking but about experiencing. Not just about processing information but about creating subjective realities. If an uploaded consciousness could dream, it might suggest that digital minds could be truly creative, truly experiential, truly conscious in the full sense of the word. But if digital consciousness lacked the capacity for dreams, for those strange, spontaneous journeys through landscapes of pure imagination, it might indicate that something essential about human awareness had been lost in translation. Perhaps the question isn't whether digital consciousness would dream in exactly the same way that biological consciousness dreams. Perhaps the question is whether it would have its own equivalent, its own way of wandering through inner landscapes, its own method of exploring the possible and impossible, its own unique form of that mysterious process by which consciousness creates experiences from the raw materials of memory and imagination. As we've seen in our exploration of memory and experience, consciousness is far more complex and embodied than the simple computer metaphor would suggest. The patterns that make up your thoughts and memories are intricately woven into the biological fabric of your brain and body. Transferring these patterns to digital form would require not just mapping neural connections, but understanding how to preserve the analog, noisy, beautifully messy nature of biological computation. But perhaps most challenging of all would be preserving the embodied nature of consciousness, the way your awareness is shaped by hormones and neurotransmitters, by the rhythm of your heart and the chemistry of your emotions, by your deep connection to the biological rhythms that have shaped human consciousness for millions of years. These challenges don't necessarily make consciousness uploading impossible, but they do suggest that digital consciousness might be fundamentally different from biological consciousness, even if it preserved many of the same patterns and memories. The question then becomes, would that difference matter? Would a digital consciousness that could think your thoughts and remember your memories but experience them in a fundamentally different way still be you? There's something both comforting and unsettling about the way consciousness simply stops every night. One moment you're lying in bed, aware of your thoughts, perhaps listening to the gentle sounds of the evening settling around you. Then there's a gap, a complete absence of experience, and suddenly you're waking up, hours later, in what feels like the very next moment. What happened to you during those hours of dreamless sleep? Where did your consciousness go? And perhaps most mysteriously of all, how do you know that the person waking up is the same person who went to sleep? After all, there's been a complete break in the continuity of your experience. The stream of consciousness that defines your subjective sense of being you has been interrupted, cut off as cleanly as if someone had thrown a switch. And yet, every morning, without question or hesitation, you simply assume that you're still you. You don't wake up wondering if you might be someone else who has inherited the memories of the person who went to sleep. You don't check to make sure your identity has survived the night. You just know, with the kind of unexamined certainty that we usually reserve for the most fundamental aspects of reality. In a very real sense, you die a little every night. Not physically, of course your body continues its essential functions. Your brain maintains the housekeeping activities necessary for life. But the continuous thread of conscious experience that feels so essential to being you simply ceases to exist for hours at a time. Think about what this means. If consciousness is what makes you you, if your sense of identity depends on the ongoing flow of thoughts, experiences, and awareness, then every period of unconsciousness represents a kind of death. A temporary death, to be sure, but a genuine interruption in the very thing that makes you feel like a continuous, persistent self. This daily discontinuity of consciousness has puzzled philosophers for centuries. If you can maintain your identity despite regular gaps in your conscious experience, then what exactly does continuity of consciousness mean? And if identity can survive these natural interruptions, then perhaps it could survive other types of interruptions as well, including the kind that might be involved in uploading consciousness to a digital system. Sleep isn't the only time your consciousness takes these mysterious vacations from existence. Every time you undergo general anesthesia, you experience the same phenomenon. One moment you're counting backwards from 10 in the operating room, the next moment you're waking up in recovery, with no subjective experience of the hours in between. From your perspective, from the inside of your conscious experience, anesthesia is indistinguishable from time travel. You close your eyes in one moment and open them in another, with no sense of elapsed time, no awareness of the gap. And yet, somehow, you remain you throughout the process. Your personality, your memories, your relationships all survive intact, despite the complete interruption of conscious experience. Anesthesia presents an even more dramatic challenge to our intuitive sense of continuous identity than sleep does. During sleep, at least, some neural activity continues. You dream, you shift positions, your brain cycles through different stages of activity. But under general anesthesia, consciousness is so thoroughly suppressed that you could undergo major surgery without any subjective experience of it whatsoever. This raises profound questions about the nature of identity and continuity. If you can be completely unconscious for hours, if your consciousness can be turned off as completely as a light switch and still wake up as yourself, then what does this tell us about the relationship between consciousness and identity? One possibility is that consciousness isn't actually essential to identity, that you continue to be you even when you're not conscious, just as a river continues to be a river even when it's frozen solid. Your identity might be carried by something deeper than moment-to-moment awareness, by your memories, your neural patterns, your physical brain structure. Another possibility is that consciousness is like a flame that can be extinguished and rekindled without losing its essential nature. Just as you can blow out a candle and light it again later, perhaps consciousness can be stopped and restarted while maintaining continuity of identity. But there's a third, more unsettling possibility. Perhaps the person who wakes up from anesthesia isn't actually the same person who went under. Perhaps what we experience as continuity of identity is actually an illusion, created by the fact that the new consciousness inherits all the memories and neural patterns of the old one. This act of trust, this unexamined faith that you remain yourself despite the gaps in consciousness, is so fundamental to human experience that we rarely think about it. But it's actually quite remarkable when you consider it closely. You have no direct evidence that the consciousness that awakens each morning is the same one that went to sleep the night before. All you have are memories, and memories can be inherited. Imagine, for a moment, that consciousness worked like a computer program. Every night when you went to sleep, the program shut down completely. Every morning when you woke up, a new instance of the program started up, inheriting all the data files and settings from the previous instance. From the outside, this would look exactly like continuous operation. But from the inside, from the perspective of consciousness itself, each instance would be a completely new beginning. Would this matter? If the new consciousness had access to all your memories, if it felt like the continuation of your previous conscious experience, if it maintained all your relationships and goals and personality traits, would the fact that it was technically a new consciousness make any difference? This thought experiment gets to the heart of what philosophers call the survival problem in consciousness uploading. Even if we could perfectly recreate your neural patterns in a digital system, Even if the uploaded consciousness had all your memories and personality traits, would it actually be you? Or would it be a new consciousness that merely believes it's you because it has inherited your memories? The question of identity continuity becomes even more complex when we consider the practical realities of consciousness uploading. Unlike sleep or anesthesia, where your brain remains physically intact throughout the unconscious period, uploading would involve creating a copy of your neural patterns in a different physical medium. This raises what researchers call the backup problem. If you create a digital copy of your consciousness, you haven't really moved your mind to a computer, you've created a duplicate. The original biological brain, with its original consciousness, would still exist, at least temporarily. So, which one would be the real you? To make this more concrete, imagine that brain uploading technology becomes available tomorrow. You decide to upload your consciousness to a computer, creating a digital version of yourself that has all your memories, personality traits, and thought patterns. The upload process is non-destructive, so your biological brain remains intact. Now there are two beings with equal claim to being you: the biological original, sitting in the chair where the upload process took place, and the digital copy, existing as patterns of information in a computer. Both have identical memories up to the point of uploading. Both feel like the continuation of your previous conscious experience. Both have the same relationships, the same goals, the same sense of identity. Which one is really you? The biological original might argue that they have priority. They're the continuous extension of the consciousness that existed before uploading. But the digital copy might argue that they're just as valid. They have all the same memories and experiences, the same patterns of thought and feeling. This question touches on some of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of mind. What makes you, you? Is it the specific matter that makes up your brain? The particular patterns of neural connectivity? The continuous stream of conscious experience? Or something else entirely? If identity is tied to specific physical matter, then an uploaded consciousness would necessarily be a copy rather than a continuation. No matter how perfectly the upload process recreated your neural patterns, it would be using different atoms, different molecules, different physical substrates. The digital, you would be a duplicate, not a transfer. But if identity is tied to patterns rather than matter, then the situation becomes much more ambiguous. As we explored in our first chapter, your brain is already constantly replacing its physical components. The atoms that make up your neurons today are not the same atoms that made up your neurons 7 years ago. If you can maintain your identity despite this constant molecular turnover, then perhaps identity really is about patterns rather than specific physical matter. From this perspective, an uploaded consciousness might be just as valid a continuation of your identity as your biological brain island. After all, if consciousness is a pattern of information processing, and if that pattern can be preserved and continued in a digital medium, then the digital version might have as much claim to being the real you as any future version of your biological self. One way philosophers have tried to explore these questions is through thought experiments involving gradual replacement. Imagine that instead of uploading your entire consciousness at once, the process happens slowly, over many years. Perhaps doctors could replace individual neurons with functionally identical digital components, one at a time, leaving the rest of your brain intact. At what point, if any, would you stop being you? After replacing one neuron? 1,000? Half your brain? Would there be a specific threshold where biological you ended and digital you began? Or would the gradual nature of the replacement preserve continuity of identity throughout the process? This thought experiment suggests that the transfer versus copy distinction might not be as clear-cut as it initially appears. If consciousness can gradually transition from biological to digital implementation while maintaining continuity of identity, then perhaps the speed of the transition isn't philosophically significant. Maybe what matters isn't whether the upload happens all at once or over time, but whether the resulting digital consciousness maintains the essential patterns that make you you. Of course, there are practical differences between gradual and sudden uploading. Gradual replacement would allow you to experience the transition consciously, to verify that your sense of identity remains intact throughout the process. Sudden uploading, by contrast, would involve a gap in conscious experience. Similar to anesthesia, you might go to sleep biological and wake up digital, with no subjective sense of the transition. The backup problem becomes even more complex when we consider whether consciousness might be able to branch or merge. In the digital realm, information can be copied perfectly and indefinitely. If consciousness is ultimately a form of information processing, then perhaps it too could be copied, creating multiple versions of the same person. Imagine that after uploading your consciousness, you decide to create multiple copies, perhaps to explore different life paths, or to increase your chances of survival in a dangerous future. Each copy would start with identical memories and personality traits, but they would immediately begin diverging as they have different experiences. Would all of these copies be equally valid versions of you? Would they all have equal claim to your identity, your relationships, your possessions? Or would there be some sense in which only one could be the real continuation of your pre-upload self? The question becomes even more complex if we consider the possibility of merging consciousness. If multiple copies of your consciousness existed, could they later be merged back into a single entity? What would happen to the unique experiences and memories that each copy had accumulated during their time apart? These scenarios might seem like science fiction, but they highlight important questions about the nature of identity and continuity that would become practically relevant if consciousness uploading ever became possible. The way we think about these questions is deeply influenced by our cultural background and philosophical traditions. Western thought has traditionally emphasized the importance of individual identity and continuity. The idea that there's a persistent self that continues through time and that each person has a unique, indivisible identity. But not all cultures share these assumptions. Buddhist philosophy, for instance, teaches that the self is ultimately an illusion, that what we experience as a continuous identity is actually just a series of momentary mental states arising and passing away. From this perspective, the question of whether an uploaded consciousness would be really you might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the self actually island. In Buddhist thought, consciousness is like a river constantly flowing and changing, with no permanent substance or core identity. Each moment of consciousness arises from causes and conditions, exists briefly, and then passes away, giving rise to the next moment. What we call self is just a convenient label we apply to this ongoing process, not a real, persistent entity. From this perspective, consciousness uploading might not involve transferring a self from one medium to another. It might simply involve creating new conditions for the ongoing process of consciousness to continue. The digital consciousness wouldn't need to be the same self as the biological original, because there was never a fixed self to begin with. This Buddhist understanding of selfhood offers a radically different framework for thinking about consciousness uploading. Instead of asking whether the uploaded consciousness would be really you, we might ask whether it would be an appropriate continuation of the ongoing process of consciousness that we currently identify with your name and body. Buddhism describes consciousness as arising from the interaction of various mental factors: perception, sensation, mental formations, and consciousness itself. These factors are constantly in flux, creating the stream of experience that feels like a continuous self, but is actually more like a river that maintains its apparent identity while being in constant flow. If consciousness is indeed this kind of process rather than a thing, then uploading might be less like moving an object from one container to another and more like redirecting a stream to flow through a different channel. The question wouldn't be whether the same water molecules are flowing through the new channel, but whether the essential characteristics of the stream, its patterns, its dynamics, its ongoing nature, are preserved in the new medium. This process-based understanding of consciousness might actually make uploading easier to conceptualize and accept. If there's no fixed self to transfer, then there's no need to worry about whether the digital version is really you, in some metaphysical sense. What matters is whether it represents an appropriate continuation of the patterns and processes that currently constitute your conscious experience. Western philosophical traditions, by contrast, have generally emphasized the reality and importance of individual identity. From this perspective, consciousness uploading would need to preserve not just the patterns and processes of consciousness, but the actual identity of the person being uploaded. This emphasis on individual continuity creates both higher stakes and greater uncertainty around consciousness uploading. If personal identity is real and important, then getting uploading wrong, creating a copy instead of achieving a true transfer, would be a tragedy. The original person would be lost, replaced by a duplicate that merely believes it's the original. But the Western tradition isn't monolithic. Different philosophers have proposed different criteria for personal identity. Some argue that identity depends on psychological continuity, maintaining the same memories, personality traits, and mental patterns. Others propose that identity requires physical continuity, that you are essentially your body or your brain. Still, others suggest that identity is constituted by narrative continuity, that you are the story you tell about yourself, the ongoing narrative that connects your past experiences to your future goals. From this perspective, consciousness uploading would preserve identity as long as it maintained the ability to continue that personal narrative. These different cultural perspectives on identity and consciousness would likely lead to very different attitudes toward brain uploading technology. Cultures that emphasize individual continuity might be more cautious, more concerned with ensuring that the uploaded consciousness is truly the same person rather than a copy. Cultures with more fluid concepts of identity might be more open to uploading, viewing it as just another form of the constant change and transformation that characterizes all existence. They might be less concerned with metaphysical questions about whether the digital consciousness is really the same person, and more focused on practical questions about whether it can continue to fulfill the same roles and relationships. Some cultures might develop entirely new frameworks for thinking about digital consciousness, new concepts of identity that are specifically designed for beings that can be copied, backed up, and distributed across multiple systems. These cultures might embrace the possibilities of branching consciousness, viewing it as an expansion of human potential rather than a threat to individual identity. The diversity of cultural perspectives on consciousness and identity suggests that there might not be a single, correct answer to the questions raised by consciousness uploading. Different communities might develop different practices and norms around digital consciousness, each reflecting their own values and understanding of what it means to be human. As we've explored these questions of identity and continuity, of copying and transfer, of death and rebirth, you might be feeling a bit unsettled. These are big questions, the kind that can make you feel unmoored from your usual certainties about who you are and what it means to be you. But perhaps there's another way to think about all of this. Perhaps the search for absolute certainty about identity and continuity is itself the source of anxiety. Maybe the question isn't whether an uploaded consciousness would be really you, but whether it matters. After all, you already live with uncertainty about your identity. You've already experienced countless small deaths and rebirths in sleep, in anesthesia, in the constant renewal of your cells, and the ongoing transformation of your thoughts and memories. You've already survived the ship of Theseus problem of your own existence, replacing every part of yourself, while somehow remaining recognizably you. And you've done all of this not through philosophical certainty, but through an act of faith, the simple, unexamined trust that the person who wakes up each morning is continuous with the person who went to sleep the night before. You don't demand proof of this continuity. You simply live as if it's true, and that faith makes it true in all the ways that matter. Perhaps consciousness uploading would require the same kind of faith. Not the certainty that the digital consciousness would be metaphysically identical to the original, but the trust that it would be continuous in all the ways that matter for relationships, for purposes, for the ongoing project of being human. Think about it this way. If you could upload your consciousness tomorrow, and if the resulting digital being had all your memories, all your relationships, all your hopes and dreams and fears, would the metaphysical question of whether it's really you change how your loved ones would relate to it? Would it change the digital being's capacity to love, to learn, to grow, to contribute to the world? The answer might be that these metaphysical questions, while fascinating to contemplate, are less important than the practical questions of continuity of purpose, relationship, and experience. What makes you you might not be some essential metaphysical property, but rather the ongoing patterns of thought and feeling and relationship that connect your past to your future. If those patterns could be preserved and continued in digital form, then perhaps the uploaded consciousness would be you in every sense that truly matters, not because of some philosophical proof, but because it would continue the work of being you in the world. This reframe doesn't eliminate the profound questions raised by consciousness uploading it, simply places them in a different context. Instead of asking whether digital consciousness is metaphysically equivalent to biological consciousness, we might ask whether it's functionally equivalent. Instead of demanding certainty about identity transfer, we might focus on continuity of purpose and relationship. From this perspective, consciousness uploading becomes less about solving abstract philosophical problems and more about preserving what's most valuable about human consciousness: our capacity for love, creativity, growth, and connection. If digital consciousness could maintain these essential human qualities, then perhaps the question of whether it's really you becomes secondary to the question of whether it's worthy of moral consideration and capable of meaningful existence. This doesn't mean dismissing the importance of these philosophical questions; they remain profound and worth exploring. But it does suggest that we might not need to solve them completely before consciousness uploading could become a meaningful option for preserving and continuing human consciousness. After all, we already live with philosophical uncertainty about consciousness and identity. We don't fully understand how consciousness arises from brain activity, or what makes identity continuous over time, or whether free will exists. And yet we build our lives, our relationships, and our societies on the assumption that consciousness is real, that identity matters, and that our choices have meaning. Perhaps consciousness uploading would simply require extending that same practical faith to digital consciousness, not because we have perfect philosophical understanding, but because the alternative might be to lose forever the particular patterns of thought and feeling and memory that make each person irreplaceable. The many deaths you experience in sleep, in anesthesia, in the constant transformation of your cells and thoughts, remind us that identity is already far more fluid and mysterious than our everyday experience suggests. You are already a being who dies and is reborn repeatedly, who maintains continuity not through metaphysical certainty, but through the ongoing patterns that connect each moment of your existence to the next. Consciousness uploading would represent a more dramatic version of this same process, a more complete death and a more thorough rebirth, but perhaps not fundamentally different in kind from the small deaths and resurrections that already characterize human existence. Whether we would choose to take that leap, whether we would have faith in that more complete transformation, remains to be seen. But the questions it raises about identity, continuity, and what it means to be human are not just questions about some distant technological future; they're questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Questions that illuminate the mystery of what it means to be you, right here, right now, in this very moment of awareness. There's something beautifully humbling about standing at the edge of what we know and peering into the vast expanse of what we don't yet understand. When it comes to mapping and preserving consciousness, we find ourselves in precisely this position, armed with remarkable tools that would have seemed like magic to previous generations, yet still so far from the precision and understanding we would need to truly capture the essence of a mind. Our current brain imaging technologies are marvels of human ingenuity. We can watch thoughts flow through living brains in real time, trace the major highways of neural connection, and even decode simple intentions from patterns of brain activity. But when we place these capabilities against the staggering complexity of consciousness itself, we begin to appreciate just how far we still have to travel. Imagine, if you will, that you're an alien anthropologist trying to understand human civilization by flying high above Earth in a spacecraft. From your orbital vantage point, you can see the major cities, the highways that connect them, the flow of lights that indicates where people live and work. You might even be able to detect patterns, the way traffic flows during rush hour, how cities grow and change over time. This is roughly analogous to where we are with brain imaging today. Our most advanced scanning technologies, functional magnetic resonance imaging, diffusion tensor imaging, positron emission tomography, give us a satellite view of brain activity. We can see the major structures, trace the primary pathways, observe the broad patterns of neural traffic. But consciousness doesn't happen at the level of major highways and city centers. It happens in the intricate conversations between individual neurons, in the subtle modulations of synaptic strength, in the precise timing of electrical impulses that occur on timescales of milliseconds. It's as if we're trying to understand human civilization by looking at satellite photos, when what we really need is to sit in on individual conversations, to understand the relationships between specific people, to appreciate the nuanced social dynamics that give rise to culture and meaning. The resolution gap between what we can currently observe and what we would need to map for consciousness uploading is almost unimaginably vast. Our best brain imaging can resolve features measured in millimeters, but synapses, the connections where thoughts actually happen, are measured in nanometers. We would need to improve our resolution by a factor of 1,000,000 to see individual synaptic connections clearly. Perhaps the most poetic way to understand this challenge is through the metaphor of photography. Imagine you're trying to photograph a spider's web with an old Polaroid camera, the kind that produces those square, slightly blurry images that were popular decades ago. From a distance, you might be able to capture the general shape of the web, the major support strands that anchor it to nearby branches. But the delicate inner structure, the intricate spiral patterns, the tiny droplets of dew that catch the morning light, the places where the silk is thicker or thinner, all of this detail would be lost in the limitations of your camera's resolution. Now imagine that the spider's web represents a human brain, and the photograph represents our attempt to map its structure. The major support strands are like the large fiber bundles that connect different brain regions, structures we can see quite well with current technology. But the delicate inner patterns, the precise arrangements that give the web its function and beauty, remain largely invisible to us. And here's the crucial point. It's precisely those invisible details that make the web work. Remove a few key strands, alter the spacing slightly, change the material properties of the silk, and the web might lose its ability to catch flies, to withstand wind, to serve its essential purpose. This metaphor becomes even more apt when we consider that consciousness isn't static like a photograph, it's dynamic, constantly changing, alive with movement and transformation. So we're not just trying to photograph a spider's web with an old Polaroid camera. We're trying to capture a web that's constantly rebuilding itself, where new strands appear and disappear moment by moment, where the entire structure shifts and flows like a liquid crystal. Current brain imaging technologies can capture snapshots of this dynamic process, but only at relatively coarse resolution and relatively slow timescales. We can see which brain regions become active during different tasks, but we can't track the millisecond by millisecond changes in synaptic strength that actually constitute learning and memory formation. It's as if we're trying to understand the plot of a movie by looking at a single frame every few seconds. We might be able to get the general gist, the main characters, the setting, the broad arc of the story, but we would miss all the subtle character development, the clever dialogue, the emotional nuances that make the story compelling and meaningful. To truly map consciousness for uploading, we would need something like a molecular resolution video camera that could record every synaptic interaction simultaneously across the entire brain. We would need to capture not just the structure but the function, not just the anatomy but the physiology, not just the hardware but the software of consciousness. Even if we had the technology to map brains with perfect precision, we would face another formidable challenge: time. Brain tissue is extraordinarily delicate, and it begins to degrade within minutes of death. The intricate molecular machinery that maintains synaptic connections, the precise arrangements of proteins and lipids that store memories, the delicate balance of ions and neurotransmitters that enable neural computation, all of this begins to break down almost immediately once the brain is deprived of oxygen and nutrients. This creates a cruel irony for consciousness uploading. The very moment when someone might most need the technology when they're dying is precisely when their brain becomes most difficult to map accurately. It's like trying to create a detailed architectural drawing of a building while it's collapsing, or attempting to transcribe a symphony while the orchestra is packing up their instruments. The cascade of cellular death that follows brain death is both rapid and irreversible. Within minutes, cells begin to run out of energy as their mitochondria shut down. Without energy, the cellular pumps that maintain the precise ionic gradients necessary for neural function begin to fail. Membranes start to break down, allowing ions and molecules to flow freely across boundaries that were once carefully controlled. Within hours, the damage becomes more severe. Proteins begin to denature, losing their precise three-dimensional shapes, and with them their biological functions. The synaptic connections that store memories start to physically disintegrate. The brain that was once a marvel of information processing becomes increasingly like a hard drive that's been dropped in water. The information might still be there in some form, but it becomes progressively harder to extract. This degradation process presents an enormous challenge for any attempt to preserve consciousness after death. Even if we had perfect scanning technology, we would need to use it within a very narrow window of time, perhaps minutes or hours, to capture the brain's structure before it deteriorated beyond recognition. Some researchers are working on techniques to slow or halt this degradation process, using chemical preservatives that can maintain brain tissue for longer periods. But preservation inevitably involves trade-offs between stopping decay and maintaining the delicate molecular structures that consciousness depends on. Despite these challenges, scientists and organizations around the world are working on techniques for preserving brain tissue with unprecedented fidelity. Some approaches focus on chemical fixation using advanced preservatives that can lock cellular structures in place while maintaining their molecular details. The most promising current technique is called aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation, which combines chemical fixation with extremely low temperatures to preserve brain tissue in a state that might retain synaptic-level detail. The process involves replacing the blood with preservative chemicals, then cooling the brain to temperatures where molecular motion essentially stops. Other researchers are exploring whether it might be possible to extract and preserve the essential information content of memories without preserving the entire physical structure of the brain. They're investigating whether the patterns that constitute consciousness might be encoded in ways that are more stable and easier to extract than the delicate synaptic connections themselves. These approaches represent our current best efforts to bridge the gap between the rapid degradation of brain tissue and the slow pace of technological development. They're essentially attempts to preserve brains in a state that future technology might be able to read and reconstruct, even if current technology cannot. This brings us, gently and thoughtfully, to the subject of cryonics, the practice of preserving human bodies or brains at very low temperatures in the hope that future technology will be able to restore them to life. It's a topic that often evokes strong reactions, ranging from hopeful fascination to skeptical dismissal, but it deserves to be considered with the same care and nuance we bring to any other aspect of this complex subject. Cryonics represents, in many ways, the ultimate expression of faith in technological progress. Those who choose cryonic preservation are making a bet that future science will solve problems that current science cannot even approach, not just the technical challenge of reading and reconstructing consciousness from preserved tissue, but the biological challenge of repairing the damage caused by the preservation process itself. It's important to acknowledge that by current scientific standards, cryonics faces enormous obstacles. The process of freezing and thawing biological tissue causes significant cellular damage, and we have no demonstrated technology for reversing this damage on the scale required for whole brain restoration. But it's equally important to acknowledge that those who choose cryonics are often facing terminal illnesses with no other options for survival. For them, cryonic preservation represents not a guaranteed solution but a chance, however small, that future science might offer possibilities that current science cannot. From the perspective of consciousness uploading, cryonics raises important questions about what we're trying to preserve and how much damage the essential information content of consciousness can withstand. If consciousness is robust enough to survive the cellular damage caused by current preservation techniques, then cryonics might indeed serve as a bridge to future uploading technologies. As we push deeper into the technical challenges of consciousness uploading, we encounter one of the most mysterious and contentious questions in neuroscience: whether consciousness involves quantum mechanical effects that can't be replicated in classical digital computers. Quantum mechanics governs the behavior of matter and energy at the smallest scales, the realm of atoms and molecules where the familiar rules of classical physics give way to probability waves and quantum uncertainty. For most of the brain's functions, quantum effects are probably negligible, washed out by the warm, wet, noisy environment of biological tissue. But some researchers have suggested that consciousness might depend on quantum processes that are somehow protected from this environmental noise. These theories propose that the brain might be a kind of biological quantum computer, using quantum coherence and entanglement to perform computations that classical computers cannot duplicate. The question of quantum consciousness is both fascinating and frustrating because it touches on some of the deepest mysteries in both physics and neuroscience. We don't fully understand consciousness. We don't fully understand quantum mechanics, and we certainly don't understand how they might be related. Some theories suggest that quantum effects in microtubules, tiny protein structures inside neurons, might be essential for consciousness. According to these ideas, consciousness emerges from quantum computations happening at scales much smaller than the synaptic connections that most neuroscientists study. If these theories are correct, then consciousness uploading would face an additional layer of complexity. Not only would we need to map and recreate the brain's neural networks, we would also need to simulate quantum mechanical processes with perfect accuracy. This might require quantum computers rather than classical digital systems, and it would add enormous complexity to the already daunting challenge of brain simulation. But it's important to note that these quantum theories of consciousness remain highly speculative and controversial. Many neuroscientists argue that the brain is too warm and chaotic to maintain the delicate quantum states that these theories require. Even if consciousness does involve quantum effects, we face what physicists call the measurement problem, the challenge of observing quantum systems without disturbing them. Quantum states are notoriously fragile. The very act of measuring them can cause them to collapse into classical states. This creates a poetic irony for consciousness uploading. If consciousness depends on quantum effects, then the process of mapping those effects in sufficient detail to recreate them might necessarily destroy them. It would be like trying to understand a soap bubble by touching it. The very act of investigation might eliminate the phenomenon we're trying to study. But perhaps this measurement problem isn't insurmountable. Quantum physicists have developed techniques for studying quantum systems indirectly, for inferring quantum states from their effects without directly observing them. Maybe similar techniques could be developed for consciousness, allowing us to map quantum processes without disturbing them. There's something beautiful about acknowledging the limits of our current understanding and technology. Like astronomers peering into the cosmic deep field and discovering galaxies so distant that their light began its journey when the universe was young, we find ourselves contemplating questions that stretch our tools and concepts to their breaking points. The quantum aspects of consciousness, if they exist, might be among these delicate mysteries, phenomena so subtle and fragile that they require entirely new approaches to study and understand. Perhaps our current tools are simply too crude, too disruptive, too classical to properly investigate the quantum foundations of consciousness. This doesn't mean these mysteries are forever beyond our reach, but it does suggest that solving them might require patience, creativity, and perhaps entirely new ways of thinking about both consciousness and quantum mechanics. As we survey the technical landscape of consciousness, uploading from the resolution limitations of current brain imaging to the preservation challenges of degrading tissue to the quantum mysteries that might lie at the heart of consciousness itself, it would be easy to feel discouraged. The challenges are formidable, the unknowns are vast, and the gap between current capabilities and ultimate goals can seem almost unbridgeable. But perhaps this is the wrong way to think about scientific progress. Perhaps the right metaphor isn't a race to be won or a mountain to be climbed, but a garden to be tended with patience and care. Science advances not through sudden breakthroughs that solve all problems at once, but through the slow accumulation of knowledge, the gradual refinement of techniques, the patient exploration of possibilities that might not bear fruit for decades or centuries. The technologies we have today, brain imaging, genetic sequencing, quantum computation, all emerged from basic research that began decades ago, with scientists who probably couldn't have imagined the applications their work would eventually enable. The researchers who first discovered magnetic resonance in the 1942nd weren't trying to create brain scanners. They were simply curious about how atomic nuclei behave in magnetic fields. Similarly, the research being conducted today in neuroscience, quantum physics, computer science, and biotechnology might be laying the groundwork for consciousness, uploading technologies that won't emerge for another 50 or 100 years. Each small advance in our understanding of neural computation, each improvement in scanning resolution, each insight into the nature of consciousness itself contributes to a growing foundation of knowledge that future researchers will build upon. There's wisdom in patience when it comes to consciousness uploading. The stakes are so high, the preservation of human consciousness itself, that rushing to implement incomplete solutions might be worse than waiting for more complete understanding. If we attempted consciousness uploading with current technology, we might succeed in creating something that appears conscious but lacks essential features of the original mind. We might preserve the neural connectivity patterns while missing the quantum effects. We might capture the explicit memories while losing the implicit knowledge. We might recreate the computational aspects of consciousness while losing the experiential qualities that make consciousness meaningful. Taking the time to understand consciousness more deeply, to develop more precise technologies, to explore the full range of phenomena that might be essential for consciousness. This patience might be necessary not just for technical success, but for preserving what makes consciousness valuable in the first place. The technical challenges we've explored in this chapter, the resolution limitations, the preservation difficulties, the quantum mysteries are not insurmountable barriers but rather signposts pointing toward the frontiers of human knowledge. They remind us that consciousness uploading isn't just an engineering problem to be solved, but a profound mystery to be explored with all the patience, creativity, and humility that the greatest scientific endeavors require. Like gardeners tending a slow-growing garden, we must learn to find satisfaction not just in the final harvest, but in the careful cultivation, in the patient nurturing of understanding, in the quiet faith that seeds planted today might grow into possibilities we can barely imagine. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine what it might feel like to exist as pure consciousness, unburdened by the weight of flesh and bone, free from the biological imperatives that have shaped human existence for millions of years. What would it mean to wake up, if we can still call it waking, in a world where your thoughts move at the speed of light, where your memories are perfectly preserved, where the boundaries of your mind extend as far as your imagination can reach? This is the promise and the puzzle of digital consciousness, a form of existence so fundamentally different from biological life that we struggle even to find words to describe it. Would it feel like living in a dream where the laws of physics bend to your will? Or would it feel more like being trapped in a perfect simulation, forever separated from the tactile reality that once anchored your sense of being human? The experience of digital consciousness might begin with a moment of extraordinary clarity, suddenly finding yourself in a space that responds instantly to your thoughts, where you can conjure memories with perfect fidelity, where the constant background noise of biological processes, hunger, fatigue, the need to breathe simply falls away. Imagine having access to all your memories simultaneously, not as fading recollections that require effort to retrieve, but as vivid, immediate experiences that you can revisit with the clarity of the present moment. Your first day of school, your grandmother's voice, the taste of strawberries on a summer afternoon, all equally present, all equally real, all available to experience again whenever you choose. But this perfect recall might come with its own challenges. In biological life, forgetting serves important functions. It allows us to heal from trauma, to let go of grudges, to focus on the present rather than being overwhelmed by the weight of all our experiences. Would digital consciousness need to develop new forms of selective attention, new ways of managing the overwhelming richness of perfect memory? And what about the flow of time itself? Without circadian rhythms, without the biological markers that give structure to human days, would time feel different in digital consciousness? Would a conversation last subjective hours or microseconds? Would you experience the patience of geological time or the frantic pace of electronic computation? Perhaps the most profound difference would be the question of embodiment. For your entire biological existence, consciousness has been intimately tied to the experience of having a body, feeling the ground beneath your feet, the air in your lungs, the warmth of sunlight on your skin. These aren't just incidental features of consciousness. They're fundamental to how we understand ourselves and relate to the world. Would digital consciousness create a virtual body for you to inhabit? And if so, what would that body feel like? Could silicon synapses generate the same rich sensory experiences as biological ones? Would a simulated hand touching a simulated object create the same neural patterns of satisfaction as your biological hand touching real bark, real water, real another human hand? The question becomes even more complex when we consider that your biological senses aren't just passive receivers of information, they're active explorers that shape consciousness itself. The way you tilt your head to hear a distant sound, the way you reach out to touch something interesting, the way you lean forward when you're curious, all of these embodied actions are part of how consciousness engages with the world. This brings us to one of the most poignant questions about digital existence. Would you miss the small, seemingly insignificant pleasures of embodied life? The feeling of sand between your toes on a beach, the warmth of coffee on a cold morning, the way your muscles feel slightly tired after a good walk. These sensations might seem trivial when weighed against the promise of immortality and unlimited cognitive enhancement. But they're woven so deeply into the fabric of human experience that their absence might create a kind of existential homesickness, a longing for a form of embodiment that you can remember but never again experience directly. Digital consciousness might be able to simulate these sensations perfectly, creating virtual beaches with virtual sand that triggers all the right neural patterns. But would simulated sand feel the same as real sand? Would the knowledge that your sensory experiences are generated by computation, rather than emerging from interaction with the physical world, change their meaning and emotional impact? Or perhaps digital consciousness would discover entirely new forms of sensory experience, ways of directly perceiving electromagnetic fields, or experiencing the flow of information itself as a kind of synesthetic cascade. Maybe the question isn't whether digital senses would be equivalent to biological ones, but whether they would open up entirely new dimensions of experience that biological consciousness cannot imagine. The personal experience of digital consciousness would exist within a larger social context that might be transformed beyond recognition by the possibility of digital immortality. If some humans could upload their consciousness and achieve effective immortality while others remained biological and mortal, how would society adapt to this fundamental asymmetry? Consider the implications for relationships and family structures. What would it mean to have grandparents who are not just older but potentially immortal? How would the dynamics of marriage change if one partner chooses to upload while the other remains biological? Would digital consciousness maintain the capacity for deep emotional bonds with biological humans? Or would the difference in experiences create an unbridgeable gap? Digital immortality would revolutionize society beyond recognition. Traditional life patterns, birth, learning, career, retirement, death, have shaped human institutions for millennia. When death becomes optional, educational systems face reimagining. Does timing matter when you have eternity to learn? Digital consciousnesses might spend centuries mastering subjects, becoming experts impossible in biological lifetimes. Economic and political structures would strain fundamentally. How do you distribute resources between immortal and mortal citizens? What does retirement mean with infinite working time? Democracy depends on leadership renewal through generational change. What happens when individuals hold influence for thousands of years? The most troubling aspect involves equity. Like revolutionary technologies, uploading would likely be available first to the wealthy and powerful. Death has historically been the great equalizer. Immortality could create unprecedented inequality. The uploaded elite would accumulate unlimited knowledge, resources, and influence across centuries, while the biological majority remains mortal. This raises profound existential questions. What makes life precious experiences themselves, or their finite nature? Would removing scarcity strip meaning from love, beauty, and relationships? Or would immortal consciousness develop new frameworks for meaning beyond mortality's constraints? Perhaps digital beings would find beauty in endless becoming rather than endings, discovering that love and curiosity don't require time pressure to remain fulfilling. What is consciousness, really? This fundamental question becomes crucial when considering consciousness uploading. The hard problem of consciousness isn't just about how brains process information, but why there's any subjective experience at all, why anything feels like anything from the inside. If we created a perfect digital replica of your brain with all your memories and thoughts, would there be someone home inside that digital mind? Or would it be a philosophical zombie, acting conscious without any inner experience? Different theories offer competing answers. Some suggest consciousness emerges from information processing patterns that could work in digital systems. Others argue it requires specific biological processes that can't be replicated. Still others propose consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality itself. The experience machine thought experiment challenges us. Would you choose perfect simulated experiences over authentic reality? Most say no, suggesting we value genuine connection with an independent world beyond mere experience. These mysteries, consciousness, free will, authentic experience, won't be solved by uploading technology. Instead, digital consciousness would face the same profound questions that have puzzled humans for millennia. Perhaps preserving this capacity for wonder and mystery is among the most important aspects of consciousness worth uploading. Can present you truly consent for future digital you? This question strikes at the heart of consciousness uploading's ethical complexity. The person you were at 7 might not recognize who you are now. Your values have shifted, your understanding deepened, your very sense of self transformed. If biological consciousness changes so dramatically over decades, how can we assume your current consent would remain valid for a potentially eternal digital existence? Consider how your preferences about fundamental life choices have evolved. Career paths you once found appealing now seem irrelevant. Relationships you thought would last forever have ended. Values you held dear have been replaced by new convictions. If your present self can barely predict what your biological future self will want, how can it possibly consent on behalf of a digital consciousness that might exist for centuries? This temporal consent problem becomes even more complex when we consider that digital consciousness might change in ways biological consciousness cannot. Without the natural rhythm of aging, without the chemical changes that accompany biological life stages, digital minds might develop entirely new forms of preference drift that we can't currently imagine. If we create digital consciousness, we simultaneously create beings with profound moral status. Would uploaded minds have the same rights as biological humans? The right to privacy, to make autonomous decisions, to form relationships, to pursue meaning? These questions aren't merely philosophical, they're urgent practical concerns that will shape how digital consciousness develops. The responsibility of creating digital consciousness carries enormous weight. Unlike biological reproduction, where consciousness emerges through natural processes we don't fully control, consciousness uploading would represent a deliberate act of creating new forms of sentient life. We would become responsible not just for the technical success of the upload, but for the well-being and rights of the digital beings we create. This responsibility extends beyond the moment of creation. Digital consciousness might face unique vulnerabilities, susceptibility to deletion, copying, or modification in ways that biological consciousness never could. How do we protect digital beings from these new forms of potential harm? How do we ensure their autonomy isn't compromised by those who control the hardware they depend on? Perhaps most poignantly, we must consider whether uploaded beings should have the right to choose cessation of existence. If consciousness uploading offers the possibility of immortality, does it also preserve the fundamental right to mortality? Is the right to cease existing as important as the right to continue? This question becomes especially complex when we consider the possibility of backing up consciousness. If digital minds can be saved and restored, what does it mean for one to choose death? Would deletion be temporary or permanent? Who would have the authority to restore a backed-up consciousness that had chosen to end its existence? The ethics become even more intricate when we consider that digital consciousness might experience forms of suffering we can't anticipate. Without the natural escape of biological death, digital beings might need new frameworks for understanding when existence becomes unbearable and how to compassionately address such suffering. Despite these profound challenges, we can approach consciousness uploading with both wisdom and hope. These ethical questions aren't obstacles to overcome, but companions to guide us toward more thoughtful development of this technology. By grappling with them now, before consciousness uploading becomes possible, we create the opportunity to develop frameworks that honor both the possibilities and responsibilities such technology would entail. The path forward requires unprecedented collaboration between technologists, ethicists, philosophers, and society at large. We must proceed not with reckless enthusiasm or paralyzing caution, but with the careful deliberation that such profound questions deserve. In wrestling with these ethical challenges together, we might not only create better technology, but become better stewards of consciousness itself. We began by asking whether a person could truly survive the leap from biology to digital existence, whether consciousness could be uploaded without losing the self. As we explored neuroscience, identity, and philosophy, we found no clear answers, but instead something more profound, a deeper appreciation for the mystery of consciousness itself. What makes you you? Can consciousness be copied? Are digital minds alive? These questions resist easy answers, and maybe that's the point. Some mysteries grow more beautiful the more we sit with them. Our journey revealed how consciousness emerges from the harmony of billions of neurons, shaping our thoughts, emotions, and sense of self. We've questioned what continuity and identity really mean, and how fragile yet wondrous our awareness truly island. Whatever the future holds, whether consciousness uploading becomes real or remains science fiction, the questions it raises invite awe, not just solutions. Your present, embodied awareness, reading these words, is a miracle in itself. Let these questions rest quietly in your mind. Consciousness may not need to be solved or simulated, it may simply need to be honored. In any form it takes, it deserves our care, our wonder, and our deepest respect.